that you cut, and you have 2 sleeves. I'm going to demonstrate on the right sleeve. So here's the right side of my sleeves. So here's my right sleeve and here's my left sleeve. And the way I know that is I have a single notch in the front and a double notch in the back. And this line that we've drawn is on the back of the sleeve. So what I'm doing is this. I'm going to first prep one of the bias strips for you to see, and I'm going to prep the cuff by fusing the interfacing to it. Okay. Almost to the crease. There's going to be a space of about 1/8 of an inch. And this is how you always make bias. This is probably the most complicated sewing on the blouse, is a continuous bias. After you've pressed it, the sides in, you're going to repress it on its original crease. Except what you do is you press one side slightly larger. Everybody understand that? Okay? So I'm going to press it really crisply with one side slightly larger than the other. Any sewing book, anything is going to show you how to do a continuous bias placket. It's a very standard way of doing an opening on a blouse. Okay? So this is what it looks like so far. So let's take it to the machine. Right side of the fabric, on the right side of the fabric, there's your line for the bias, correct? At the bottom of the sleeve, 1/4 of an inch on either side from that line, you're going to make a mark. 1/4 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. From that 1/4 of an inch, you're going to connect it. It's like you're drawing a dart. You're connecting it to that apex point. Okay? Everybody see what I did? And what I'm going to do before I cut it, I'm going to stitch along that triangle with a small stay stitch. Okay. I drew, on the triangle that I drew, I'm going to sew very carefully along that triangle with a stay stitch. And a stay stitch was what length? 1.5. A smaller stitch. And what we're not going to do is reverse because it's a small stitch, right? So slowly and carefully, you're going to sew meticulously along that line. And when you get to the apex point, you're going to pivot. And sew down the other side of the triangle. And I don't need to reverse because it's a small stitch. But do remember to turn your machine back to 2. Okay. Now the next step is this. I'm going to slash on that center line up to my apex point. Right up, not through, but right up. I'm unfolding the bias. The right side is up, facing me. I am laying my blouse wrong side on top of right side. The blouse is on top because I need to see my stay stitch because it's going to be my stitching guide. So I'm going to leave about a 1/2 inch extra that's irrelevant. That's just extra fabric you're going to cut off, okay? And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start at the bottom of the blouse. You can make your stitch a tiny bit smaller if you want. And I'm going to lay the blouse, the stay stitch, on top of the first crease line. The stay stitch is matching up with the first crease. And I'm going to sew a few stitches, reverse, and using my stay stitch as a guide, I'm going to sew all the way up to my pivot point. And once I'm there, I'm going to stop. The needle's inside. I'm going to lift up my foot. I'm going to pivot this fabric and give it a little wiggle. And I'm going to sew down this side. I'm lining up. My stay stitch with my crease. And this is what it looks like so far. Okay? Mm-hmm. That's all it looks like. You can cut off the extra at the bottom. I don't like to cut it flush until it's done. You can even trim the bias a little bit at this point. It'll help it fold a little better. Okay. And you're going to edge stitch it. You're going to top stitch it. Well, really edge stitch because you're going to sew it very close. So I'm going to fold it and stitch it. If you want to be really, really careful, you could baste this. You could baste down the center and then stitch it. Thank you. Oops. I don't know if I screwed it up.
Each side to the middle?
I mean, you could draw this on, you could also just wing it. Clip your threads. And this is what it looks like. Okay? Step is this. The next step, we're going to fold the sleeve right sides together, and we're just going to sew the underarm sleeve, which is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which you should have notches to indicate that. It's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you're just going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance matching up your notches. And then you're going to overlock it. Okay? Thanks. Then we're I'm just going to overlock the seam allowance of the sleeve.
How much these are plate?
1/8 of an inch, just a little bit. Then I'm going to take it to the iron and press the seam towards the back, okay? Switch the bobbin thread to shearing thread, okay? So in the bobbin case goes shearing thread, okay? You're going to change the stitch length to 3 1/4. I'm going to put in 2 rows of ease stitch into the cap of the sleeve. What that means is from notch to notch, you put in 2 rows of stitches, which are longer. They're almost basting length, 3 1/4, with a shearing thread in the bobbin. And we're going to use them to gather them up next week to ease the stitch in. So the first row I'm going to do is slightly less than a 1/2 inch, slightly less, because the actual stitching will be at a 1/2 inch when I go to sew. And I would recommend testing your stitch